Thank you. So yeah, thanks everybody for an absolutely fascinating day. As I feel like I have to do that kind of mandatory disclaimer that I'm not a statistician. I'm also not an ethicist, so I'm kind of this is probably why I'm at the end of the day. And I'm going to so a while ago I got the invite from Steph to kind of come and talk at this about what do we know about what it's like for patients, research participants to take part in adaptive trials. And I do research, I do a fair amount of research on people's expectations and experience of taking part in research. I thought that sounds really interesting. And then I kind of looked at the literature, and there is basically nothing. So I thought, well, okay, so what do we know about what does good public patient involvement in adaptive trials look like? So maybe that's a kind of different way of approaching this question. And again, there is very, very little in the literature. And so at that point, I kind of started to panic slightly. But also then I became aware that Mark and Kate Sahan with Sophia and David were running this kind of workshop, which they run earlier this week. And last week, thinking about this kind of question of what is the role of public patient participants in adaptive design. And I'm going to very briefly towards the end kind of come to some of the questions, but I'm going to try and be speedy, not least because I kind of stand between myself and between everybody else and the drinks reception, but also because I want to give a chance for those members of that PPIE group who are here in the room or who are online to kind of to chip in with their thoughts, but also not to be in the sense of putting everybody on the spot. So what I want to do is really try and approach this question through this kind of highly complex model that I've put together, which kind of basically summarizes what the literature looks like around this. We have 50, 60 years of social science research looking at what's the relationship between participants in research and clinical trialists. What is it that people understand from the randomized control trial process? How do we best bring people into these kind of conversations around clinical trials? We have then a much smaller body of work on adaptive clinical trials. And then what we've been talking about a lot today isn't necessarily the adaptive trials themselves, but it's the statistical methods and the really kind of into the weeds of how do these studies work, which is why the pyramid gets very small and unstable at the bottom. So just to give a kind of overview for those who maybe for whom this kind of world is a little bit new, it's become increasingly standard and normalized, particularly over the last kind of 10 to 15 years, to recognize the role of participants and patients at various stages through the clinical trial process. So this is a diagram from EUPATI, which is the European Patients Academy for Therapeutic Intervention, which kind of offers training for patient representatives who are involved in trials in one way or another. And it's a diagram that runs all the way from kind of the setting of research priorities through things like James Lind Alliance, through to involvement in kind of regulatory processes. And it's motivated really by kind of driven by a couple of motivations. So one is the kind of the ethical argument that so this is from the working group of CHOMS a couple of years ago. So the argument that excluding patients and expected medicine users from the development and use fails to respect them as persons. It can reduce benefit, it can increase harm, and run counter to ethical principles. So there's a kind of normative argument that actually all of this involving patients and participants throughout that process is the right thing to do. There's also an argument, so if you go, this is a diagram from the NIHR, so one of the kind of largest funders of medical research in the UK, which not only kind of makes the case that this is the right thing to do, but also that it leads to better research. It can make research more relevant. It can tailor research. It can, and then finally, you're going to be asked about it by funding bodies, so it's probably the right thing to do for that reason as well. But what's happened really is that, so whilst PPIE happens across the spectrum, when you look at where and when it happens, it's very kind of concentrated. So potentially around kind of protocol design, particularly kind of around definition of endpoints and things, but a lot around, how do we make materials, patient information, consent documents, patient-facing information that's readable and accessible. So yeah, activity everywhere, but concentrated. So that's what's kind of that's the kind of broadly the PPIE landscape. But alongside that is this body of social science research, and the two can often kind of come relatively close together. But there is a kind of an important set of distinctions in terms of the work that's focused not necessarily on improving individual clinical studies, but on kind of extending our understanding of what's going on in these in a way that's transferable across the domain. And I think there are things from this work that are potentially relevant to the adaptive trials domain. Not least the opportunity to shoehorn cricket pictures into the slide at the end of the day. But so some of the things that have kind of come out of this work are looking at, how do people understand informed consent? How does that kind of consent process work in the first place? So we know from from surveys and post-consent questionnaires that that various elements of clinical trials are understood to a greater or lesser extent by people who go into trials. But also that the decision to take part in a trial is often based not necessarily on how it's designed, what it's going to do, but on the kind of social relationships associated with that, the position that people find themselves in relation to research, and the people who are talking to them about it. So actually, so this is from a focus group that we did a couple of weeks ago. Actually, we were interested in trust, so somebody talking about, they're sitting watching the lunchtime news. This is during COVID. And so this is the kind of background, in a sense, to these kind of the story of the recovery trials that we were hearing about earlier. Something where it came up on the news, the wanting volunteers to take part in vaccine trial. And if anybody's going to kill me, I'm very happy for it to be Oxford University. But it's this kind of like the trust is quick. It's these kind of things that shape how and why people become involved in research studies. And the fact that sometimes you have this idea, I think we've talked a bit about kind of borrowing in terms of control arms, but also one of the things that clinical research does is often it borrows from care relationships as well. So that there's a kind of complexity to this picture that I think we need to kind of bear in mind. And that part of that complexity is that often this distinction between what's research and what's care is unclear. And so that in ways that get talked about in terms of the kind of therapeutic misconception, the idea that people go into studies believing that the purpose of the intervention is the purpose of the trial is to deliver effective interventions rather than to find a kind of scientific generalizable information. And that while that's there for participants, it's often also there for the people who are involved in delivering trials. It's not a kind of one-way thing. And then things around randomization. I think it's interesting. We've kind of talked a bit about kind of coin tosses and things. The ways that we understand that we communicate randomization and the kind of consequences that come with that. So often in this kind of in this research literature, one of the things we find is that there's a haphazardness to randomization. That you spend all of this time explaining to somebody what a clinical trial is going to do, how it's regulated, how it's governed, the kind of safeties, and then you say, and we're going to put you into one arm based on the toss of a coin, which seems just kind of arbitrary, and so and that this can be kind of discomforting to people, and that often people will say something like, well, what will happen is that the computer will put you into one arm. And so then you have this idea that there is something in there that has agency. And I was really struck, Alex, when you were talking earlier about this idea of the kind of the trial as agent, because actually this is kind of part of how often we talk about randomization and how we hear about randomization anyway, that there's something somewhere making this decision. And so I think there's a kind of, this idea that the kind of computer's choosing and that there's something kind of that's happening that's good for me out of that is embedded there in how we understand things already. And then there's kind of questions around how do we understand study burden? And this is, yeah, this is not my picture. I kind of wish that it was my picture because it would give me something that's kind of, that kind of claims complexity. But it's trying to understand some of the things that go on in terms of how do we understand what the experience of participation is. And I just wanted to flag a few things. So things like, you know, trial information being too complex. The how do you understand equipoise, randomization? These are all things that as this kind of adaptive methods move through that pyramid from the kind of methods into practice, that this case of like, how do we communicate about this? How do we ensure that we're not exacerbating problems that already exist there in the system? I think is, yeah, very important. Yeah, there we go, look at that, animations. Okay, but then, so getting down, further down this pyramid of trying to understand, okay, so we know broadly quite a lot about clinical trial experiences. And this is, so what do we know about adaptive trials? And so this is a quote from one of those rapid reviews that Catherine mentioned earlier about which points out, you know, we've got this strong emphasis on the importance of community involvement in conducting trials, but we don't really know a lot in the adaptive trial domain. And Philip, after your talk this morning, I went on the Pronto because I thought it's kind of, it's at Cardiff. It's going to be, there's going to be kind of a PPI element there, and this was kind of so, and so yeah, there is. And the question for me is like, how does this look? Does it look different at all at the moment to what we would be doing for a standard RCT? And my kind of feeling is I'm not sure, and I'm also not sure whether it should. I think is where I'm kind of heading with this. Yeah, I'm gonna. No, in terms of where people have the kind of the very limited amount of work that people have then done to look at this. So going back to the WHO review. So some of the kind of findings there from their work on looking at the kind of reporting of community engagement and adaptive trials in public health emergencies around this kind of, you know, how do you communicate complexity? But also then considerations around consent, understanding community priorities and values, which again are kind of core things that we should do that happen within PPIE, but are perhaps more important as we make trial designs potentially more complex. And this study at the bottom from Goulau and colleagues then is kind of one of the very few looking at how do you build PPIE into numerical aspects of trials. So in these kind of domains where certainly I have been at sea during parts of the day, and if you want to build PPIE right in down to that bottom of that pyramid, what does that look like? And so their priority setting exercise ended up kind of arguing, ended up suggesting that one of the places for this is around this looking at kind of target differences. What's your kind of particularly that kind of identification of clinically meaning differences, but also the interpretation of trial results and how to disseminate them, which is where I wanted to come to some of the common comments that that were coming out, I think, of the workshop on Tuesday around, you know, what is the role of PPIE here, and part of it is this communication of results, of methods and results. If an arm closes how do you kind of communicate about that? And that sits within this kind of broader set of, this is my last one, so I'm there. Within the kind of broader set of questions, I think that hopefully if there's a follow-on workshop to this in a couple of years, that maybe there will be evidence accumulating around like how do we do this and how do we do this well, and how do adaptive trials relate back to this broader literature. So from a kind of research angle, so what are the challenges that, how does the consent process change? How do people's understandings of consent, randomization, how are they affected by the use and explanation of adaptive designs? And what is it that determines successful PPIE? In terms of what that might involve, the scope of that kind of PPIE, I think there were things that came out. So Sophia mentioned earlier these kind of questions about what is a reasonable adaptation to make to a trial and who decides. And I think also the kind of question of like, who are the reasons being given to? If you're like, who is it reasonable to? Are we talking about reasonable to the participants, reasonable to regulators? What's the difference between these kind of adaptations, stop-go, normal stop-go decisions? All of these elements of decisions around, questions on what are the assumptions that go into the kind of modeling? How do we make those scrutable, perhaps? How do we balance, I think, the requests and proposals of people who are taking part in PPIE with the statistical requirements? It's one of the things that sometimes the challenge sometimes with PPIE is not only how do we implement the things that matter to people, but how also do we explain why we're not implementing the things that matter to people? And I think this is here where you have, if there's a kind of, if people feel there's a need for an extra subgroup analysis or more subgroup analysis, how do you kind of have that conversation that, about the kind of statistical implications of that? And that then I think kind of connects to broader challenges around public engagement with statistics in general. That there is, here, I mean, we've got this kind of Center for Public Understanding of Risk, kind of John Aston and people, that I think there's an opportunity there to really think about at early stages, like how do we talk about this well? And so I'm going to stop there and just offer the floor, particularly to those people who took part in the workshop, but